The silence was wrong. That was the first thing Thomas Whitmore noticed when he stepped onto his porch that morning, coffee mug steaming in the crisp Wyoming air. In 15 years of ranching this desolate stretch of land, he had grown accustomed to the symphony of dawn, cattle lowing in the distance, the rustle of wind through sagebrush, the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. But today, an unnatural stillness hung over the landscape like a held breath. The footprints told a story he could not yet comprehend. Dozens of them, maybe more, circling his ranch house in perfect, measured patterns. Barefoot impressions in the dust, each one deliberate and precise, as if an invisible army had marched around his property while he slept. But 24 hours earlier, Thomas had been just another lonely man fighting the endless battle against isolation and the unforgiving frontier. The sun had been merciless that previous afternoon, beating down on the red clay and sparse grass that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Thomas wiped sweat from his weathered brow as he mended yet another section of fence line, the fourth break this month. At 33, his hands bore the calluses and scars of a man who had built everything he owned from nothing, who had carved a life from this harsh land through sheer determination and backbreaking labor. His nearest neighbor lived 18 miles east, and the small town of Cedar Falls was a full day's ride south. The isolation had been his choice initially, an escape from a world that had taken everything from him. His wife Sarah claimed by fever 3 winters past, the child they had never been able to have, the dreams of a family that would never be realized. Out here, in this vast emptiness, grief could expand without bumping into the concerned looks of well-meaning neighbors or the hollow comfort of empty words. The cattle were restless that day, bunching together near the water trough instead of spreading across the grazing land as they normally did. His horse, a reliable bay mare named Duchess, kept her ears pinned back and her eyes fixed on the rocky outcropping that rose like ancient sentinels along the northern border of his property. Even the dog, a mixed breed he had called Scout, seemed on edge, pacing the perimeter of the house with his nose to the ground. Thomas had dismissed these signs as the animals responding to the oppressive heat or perhaps sensing a storm building beyond the mountains. He had learned to read the language of weather and season, but he had not yet learned to interpret the subtler warnings that came from older, deeper sources. The scream shattered the afternoon stillness like breaking glass. It came from the direction of Devil's Canyon, a jagged gash in the earth where flash floods had carved impossible shapes into the rock over countless centuries. The sound was raw, desperate, unmistakably human. Thomas dropped his tools and ran toward Duchess, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The canyon was treacherous terrain, a maze of narrow passages and sudden drop-offs that could trap the unwary or claim the lives of those who ventured too deep without proper knowledge of its secrets. Local wisdom held that it was cursed ground, a place where the spirits of the dead lingered and where living men lost their way and their minds. Thomas had always considered such talk to be superstition, the kind of folklore that grew up around dangerous places to keep people safe through fear rather than common sense. But as he guided Duchess carefully down the rocky slope into the canyon's mouth, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the shadows cast by the towering walls. He found her at the bottom of a steep decline, crumpled against a boulder like a broken doll. She could not have been more than 18, with long black hair that spilled across the red stone and skin bronzed by sun and wind. Her dress, or what remained of it, was torn and bloodied, and her left ankle was bent at an angle that made Thomas wince. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold, dark as obsidian, filled with a pain that went far deeper than physical injury. They held intelligence and wariness, the look of someone who had seen too much, survived too much, trusted too little. She spoke in a language he did not recognize, though the meaning was clear enough. She was asking if he meant her harm. Thomas raised his hand slowly, keeping his voice low and steady as he would with a spooked animal. "Easy now. I am not going to hurt you. I want to help." She studied his face for a long moment, as if reading something written there in lines only she could see. Then she nodded once, a small gesture that somehow felt like the granting of a tremendous gift. Getting her out of the canyon proved to be a delicate operation. Her ankle was definitely broken, and she was weak from exposure and blood loss from numerous cuts and scrapes. Thomas fashioned a makeshift travois from deadfall branches and his rope, working carefully to avoid causing her additional pain. She remained conscious during the journey back to the ranch house, her eyes never leaving his face, as if she were memorizing every detail. When he asked her name, she pressed her hand to her chest and said, "Ayanna." When he pointed to himself and said, "Thomas," she repeated it with careful precision, though the shape of the foreign syllables seemed awkward on her tongue. The ranch house was modest but solid, built from local timber and stone with his own hands during his first years on the land. It consisted of 3 rooms, a main living area that served as kitchen and parlor, a bedroom, and a small storage room that doubled as an office. Thomas settled Ayanna on his own bed, the only comfortable spot in the house, and set about tending her injuries with the basic medical supplies he kept for treating injured livestock. As he cleaned and bandaged her wounds, he noticed details that spoke of a life lived entirely outdoors, entirely removed from the world he knew. Her hands were small but strong, marked with calluses in places that suggested expertise with tools and weapons he could not identify. Her feet were tough as leather, clearly accustomed to traveling long distances over rough terrain without the protection of shoes. Most intriguingly, she wore jewelry unlike anything he had ever seen, a necklace of carved bone and colored stones, earrings fashioned from feathers and tiny bells that chimed softly when she moved her head. These were not the crude ornaments of desperate people, but the careful work of skilled artisans, beautiful and purposeful. When he had done what he could for her injuries, Thomas retreated to the main room and tried to make sense of what had happened. The girl was clearly native, though he could not identify which tribe. The nearest reservation was more than 100 miles away, and he knew of no traveling bands in the area. How had she come to be alone in Devil's Canyon, injured and apparently fleeing from something? That first evening passed in careful silence. Thomas prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, bringing her a portion along with fresh water. She ate slowly, watching him with those dark eyes that seemed to take in everything: the sparse furnishings, the photographs of Sarah on the mantelpiece, the rifle mounted above the fireplace, the books that revealed his education and his isolation. When darkness fell, Thomas made himself a bed on the floor of the main room, leaving her the privacy and comfort of the bedroom. But sleep did not come easily. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness: the settling of the house, the distant call of a night bird, the soft whisper of wind through the eaves. Somewhere in the deep hours before dawn, he thought he heard voices carried on that wind, distant, wordless, speaking in rhythms that seemed almost like chanting. But when he rose and looked out the windows, he saw only the familiar landscape bathed in starlight, empty and peaceful. Morning brought the discovery that would change everything. The footprints surrounded the house in 3 perfect concentric circles, each ring exactly 6 feet from the next. They appeared to have been made by people walking in single file, maintaining precise spacing and alignment. The prints themselves were clear and deep, pressed into the earth as if by individuals of substantial weight and size. But there were no other signs of their presence. No disturbed vegetation, no dropped items, no indication of where the mysterious visitors had come from or where they had gone. It was as if they had materialized out of thin air, performed their strange ritual, and vanished again without a trace. Thomas knelt beside one of the clearer prints, studying its shape and depth. The foot that had made it was broad and flat, with clearly defined toes and a high arch. It belonged to someone who had never worn shoes, someone whose feet had been shaped by a lifetime of walking on natural terrain. "They came for me." He spun around to find Ayanna standing in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame for support. Her face was pale but determined, and her dark eyes held a resignation that chilled him more than the mysterious footprints ever could. "Who came for you?" She limped carefully down the steps, her broken ankle making each movement an obvious struggle. When she reached the nearest ring of prints, she knelt and placed her own hand beside one of the impressions, as if greeting an old friend. "My people. They followed my trail." She looked up at him, and he saw something that might have been apology in her expression. "I brought danger to your house." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What kind of danger?" Instead of answering directly, Ayanna began to speak in her own language, her voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of formal storytelling. Though he could not understand the words, Thomas found himself drawn into the flow of her narrative, sensing epic scope and ancient significance in the rise and fall of her voice. When she finished, she translated in halting English, choosing her words with obvious care. "Long time ago, my people made agreement with the spirits of this land. We would walk the old paths, keep the old ways, protect the sacred places. In return, the spirits would protect us from those who would destroy us." She gestured toward the mountains that rose like purple shadows along the horizon. But the world changed. White men came with their wagons and their cattle and their towns. They built on sacred ground, diverted sacred waters, killed sacred animals. The agreement was broken. Thomas frowned, trying to follow the logic of her story. "But what does this have to do with you? With the footprints?" "I am keeper of the old agreement. Born to it, trained for it since I was small child. My duty is to walk between worlds, to speak for my people with the spirits, to maintain the balance." Her expression grew darker, more troubled. "But I failed in my duty. I fell in love with a white man, a trapper who came to our hunting grounds. I forgot my responsibilities, forgot my people, forgot everything except the feeling of being loved." The pain in her voice was unmistakable, the sound of someone who had lost everything through her own choices. Thomas felt a sympathetic ache in his chest, remembering his own experiences with love and loss. The spirits were angry. They sent visions, warnings, signs that I ignored. Then they sent punishment. She touched her injured ankle gingerly. "I was cast out, stripped of my power, told that I could never return until I had proven my worth through sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Ayanna looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. "The sacrifice of someone I love. Someone whose death would cause me the same pain I caused my people through my betrayal." The implication hit Thomas like a physical blow. "You think they want you to, not think." "No." She gestured again toward the rings of footprints. "They came to remind me of my duty, to tell me that my time of exile is ending, to prepare me for what must come." Thomas felt his practical, rational mind rejecting everything she was telling him. It sounded like the ravings of someone whose injuries had affected her thinking, the kind of mystical nonsense that desperate people created to explain their misfortunes. But the footprints were real. The perfect circles, the precise spacing, the complete absence of any other sign of human presence. None of it made sense according to any rational explanation he could devise. "There has to be another answer," he said, more to himself than to her. "People do not just appear and disappear. Spirits do not make bargains. These are just—" His words were cut off by a sound that raised every hair on his arms and neck. It came from the direction of the mountains, a low, resonant note that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. It was not quite music and not quite voice, but something that partook of both while remaining utterly alien to human experience. Ayanna closed her eyes and tilted her head as if listening to a familiar song. When the sound faded, she opened her eyes and looked at Thomas with an expression of profound sadness. "They are calling me home." Over the following days, Thomas found himself caught between worlds he had never imagined could exist. Ayanna's ankle healed with remarkable speed, far faster than should have been possible for such a severe break. She moved through his house like a ghost, touching nothing unnecessarily, disturbing nothing, existing in his space without quite belonging to it. She told him stories of her people, of traditions that stretched back countless generations, of a way of life that existed in harmony with forces he could barely comprehend. She spoke of vision quests and spirit animals, of sacred places where the boundary between physical and spiritual worlds grew thin, of responsibilities that were passed down through bloodlines like precious inheritances. And every night, the footprints appeared. They came in different patterns, sometimes circles, sometimes spirals, sometimes complex geometric shapes that seemed to carry meaning beyond their mere arrangement. Each morning, Thomas would find them pressed into the earth around his house, and each morning, Ayanna would study them like a scholar reading ancient texts. "They are telling me a story," she explained on the fourth day. "The story of what will happen if I continue to delay." "What will happen?" She pointed toward his cattle, which had begun behaving strangely. They huddled together during the day, refusing to graze in certain areas of the pasture. At night, they lowed constantly, a mournful sound that carried for miles across the empty landscape. First, the animals will suffer. Then the land itself will turn against you. Drought will come, then locusts, then disease. Everything you have built will be destroyed, and you will be driven from this place just as I was driven from mine. Thomas wanted to dismiss her words as superstition, but he could not ignore what he was seeing with his own eyes. His well, which had never failed in 15 years, was running lower each day. The grass in his pastures was beginning to yellow despite adequate rainfall. Even the air itself felt different, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl and his sleep restless. On the seventh night, something changed. Thomas woke to find Ayanna standing beside his makeshift bed, her face illuminated by moonlight streaming through the window. She was fully dressed, her few possessions gathered in a small bundle, her expression resolved in a way that frightened him more than all the mysterious footprints and strange omens combined. "It is time," she said simply. "Time for what?" "For me to complete my journey, to fulfill my obligation." She knelt beside him, her dark eyes reflecting the pale light. "You have been kind to me, Thomas Whitmore, kinder than I deserved, considering what my presence has brought to your life." Thomas sat up, suddenly fully awake. "Where are you going?" "To Devil's Canyon, to the place where you found me." She touched his hand briefly, a gesture that somehow felt like both greeting and farewell. "To meet those who have been waiting." The certainty in her voice chilled him. "Ayanna, you do not have to do this. Whatever you think these spirits want, whatever you believe you owe them, this is not about belief. This is about responsibility, about honor, about the price of love." She stood, her movements graceful despite her recent injuries. "My people trusted me with their most sacred obligations, and I betrayed that trust. Now I must pay the price." "What price?" She looked at him for a long moment, and he saw tears gathering in her dark eyes. "The price of caring more about my own happiness than the welfare of those who depended on me." Thomas felt a desperate urgency building in his chest, a need to stop her that went beyond rational thought. "You cannot just walk into the canyon alone. It is dangerous terrain, especially at night." "I will not be alone." She gestured toward the window, and Thomas saw them, figures moving in the distance, pale shapes that seemed to glide across the landscape without disturbing the earth beneath their feet. "They have been waiting for me to find the courage to face them." The sight of those ghostly forms moving through his familiar landscape sent ice through Thomas's veins. But stronger than fear was the realization that he could not let her go. Not like this. Not to face whatever waited in that cursed canyon by herself. "If you are determined to do this, then I am going with you." Ayanna shook her head firmly. "This is not your burden to carry." "Maybe not, but you are not going alone." Thomas rose and reached for his clothes, his mind already racing ahead to what they would need for the journey. "If your spirits want to judge you, they can judge us both." For the first time since he had found her, Ayanna smiled, a sad, grateful expression that transformed her entire face. "You do not understand what you are offering. Then explain it to me on the way." They rode through the darkness and silence, Duchess picking her way carefully across the familiar terrain while the ghostly figures maintained their distance, moving parallel to their path like an honor guard or an escort to execution. The night air was still and cold, carrying scents of sage and dust and something else, something ancient and wild that made Thomas's horse nervous and his own heart race. As they approached Devil's Canyon, the landscape began to change in subtle ways. The familiar landmarks seemed different, older, as if they were reverting to some more primitive state. The very air shimmered with energy that made Thomas's skin tingle and his vision blur at the edges. "This is as far as your horse should go," Ayanna said as they reached the canyon's rim. "What lies ahead is not meant for creatures of the everyday world." Thomas dismounted and secured Duchess to a sturdy juniper, though he doubted the reins would hold her if she decided to flee. The Mari's eyes rolled white as she stared toward the canyon, her nostrils flaring at scents he could not detect. The descent into Devil's Canyon at night was treacherous beyond description. Without the sun to reveal the true shape of the terrain, every step was an act of faith. Thomas followed Ayanna's sure-footed progress, marveling at her ability to navigate the maze of rock and shadow as if she possessed some internal compass tuned to the canyon's hidden geography. As they went deeper, the walls rose higher around them, cutting off more and more of the star-filled sky until they moved through corridors of impenetrable darkness. But somehow Ayanna continued to find the way, leading him through passages so narrow they had to turn sideways, around boulders the size of houses, down slopes that seemed to descend toward the very center of the earth. And always, just at the edge of perception, Thomas was aware of the presences that surrounded them. Not the ghostly figures he had seen from his house, but something far older and more fundamental. The spirits of the canyon itself, perhaps, awakened by their passage and curious about these intruders in their ancient domain. Finally, after what felt like hours of careful navigation, they emerged into a circular clearing surrounded by towering walls of red stone. The space was perhaps 50 feet across, perfectly flat, with a pool of dark water at its center that reflected the stars like a mirror. But it was not empty. They stood around the perimeter of the clearing, dozens of figures that seemed to be composed of shadow and starlight, neither fully solid nor completely ethereal. They wore the clothing and ornaments of Ayanna's people, but their faces were hidden beneath masks carved from wood and bone and painted with symbols that hurt Thomas's eyes to look upon directly. At the center of the group, beside the dark pool, stood a figure that was clearly their leader. Taller than the others, wearing a headdress of eagle feathers and bear claws, carrying a staff topped with a carved skull that seemed to glow with its own internal light. When this figure spoke, the words seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing from the canyon walls until they filled the entire space with sound. The language was the same one Ayanna had used in her storytelling, but the tone was formal, ritualistic, heavy with the weight of ancient authority. Thomas could not understand the words, but he felt their power, their finality, their absolute certainty. Ayanna responded in the same language, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her face. The exchange continued for several minutes, a dialogue that felt like both trial and negotiation, accusation and defense, judgment and plea for mercy. Finally, the masked figure raised its staff, and the clearing fell into absolute silence. When it spoke again, its words were in English, clearly meant for Thomas to understand. "The keeper of the old agreement has acknowledged her failure. She has confessed her betrayal of sacred trust. She has accepted the necessity of payment for her transgressions." The figure turned its hidden face toward Thomas, and he felt the weight of its attention like a physical pressure against his chest. "But she has also claimed the right of substitution. She offers the life of one she loves in place of her own, believing that such sacrifice will demonstrate her renewed commitment to our people's welfare. Thomas felt the earth seem to shift beneath his feet as the implications became clear. You want me to die in her place? Death is not the only form of sacrifice, the figure replied, but sacrifice there must be. The balance must be restored. The agreement must be renewed. Ayanna stepped forward, her voice breaking with emotion. I offer my life freely. I ask for no substitution. Let Thomas Whitmore return to his home unharmed. The offer has been made. It cannot be withdrawn. The masked figure raised its staff higher, and the other spirits began to move, forming a tighter circle around the three of them. The choice belongs to him alone. Thomas looked at Ayanna, seeing in her face the same resignation he had glimpsed that first morning when she spoke of her people coming for her. She had known this moment would come. She had tried to face it alone, and when he had insisted on coming with her, she had accepted his presence as both gift and burden. But as he stood there in that impossible place, surrounded by spirits that should not exist, faced with a choice that defied every rational principle he had ever held, Thomas realized that he had already made his decision. It had been made the moment he heard her scream in the canyon, the moment he chose to help rather than turn away, the moment he opened his heart to someone else's pain after 3 years of carefully guarded isolation. What kind of sacrifice? He asked. The masked figure gestured toward the dark pool at the center of the clearing. Step into the sacred waters. Accept the binding of the old agreement. Become keeper of the balance in her place. And if I refuse, then she dies as she was meant to die, and you return to your ranch to watch everything you have built crumble into dust. Thomas looked at Ayanna one more time, memorizing her face in the starlight, the way her dark eyes reflected both hope and despair, the courage that had carried her through unimaginable loss and brought her to this moment of truth. Then he walked to the edge of the pool and knelt beside the dark water. I accept. The water was warm as blood and twice as thick, clinging to his skin as he stepped into its depths. But as it rose around his legs, his waist, his chest, Thomas felt no fear. Instead, there was a strange sense of homecoming, as if he were returning to a place he had always belonged but never known existed. When the water closed over his head, the world transformed. He found himself standing in the same clearing, but it was different now, brighter, more vivid, filled with colors that had no names and sounds that spoke directly to his soul. The spirits around him were no longer masked figures but people, Ayanna's people. He realized the generations of keepers who had walked this path before him. And he understood, with a clarity that transcended rational thought, exactly what his new role would entail. He would be the bridge between worlds, the guardian of sacred places, the voice that spoke for those who could not speak for themselves. He would walk between the world of men and the world of spirits, ensuring that the ancient agreements were maintained and the balance preserved. It would be a lonely path, just as his life on the ranch had been lonely, but it would be a loneliness with purpose, sacrifice with meaning, isolation in service of something greater than himself. When he emerged from the pool, dripping with waters that evaporated even as they fell from his skin, Thomas found that the spirits had vanished. Only Ayanna remained, kneeling beside the dark water with her face buried in her hands. It is finished, she whispered. The debt is paid. The agreement is renewed. Thomas helped her to her feet, surprised to find that he felt no different physically. His body remained his own. His mind remained clear and rational. Only his understanding had changed, expanded to encompass truths he had never imagined. What happens now? Now you go back to your ranch. You live your life as you always have. But you will know things you did not know before, see things that others cannot see, hear voices that speak from beyond the ordinary world. She touched his hand gently, a gesture of gratitude and farewell. And when the spirits call, you will answer. They made the journey back to the ranch house in companionable silence, both of them changed by what had transpired in the depths of Devil's Canyon. The sun was rising as they reached the familiar buildings, painting the landscape in shades of gold and red that seemed more vivid than Thomas remembered. The footprints were gone, he noticed. The ground around his house showed no sign that mysterious visitors had ever walked there. Even the strange behavior of his livestock had returned to normal. The cattle grazed peacefully in their accustomed areas, and his horse whickered a greeting that held no trace of the fear that had marked her recent days. Ayanna gathered her few possessions, preparing to leave as quietly as she had arrived. But as she reached the door, Thomas found himself speaking. "You could stay." She turned back to him, her dark eyes reflecting something that might have been hope. The spirits would not approve. The spirits have what they wanted. The agreement is renewed, the balance is restored. Thomas gestured toward the peaceful landscape that surrounded them. And every keeper needs someone to help maintain the connection to the human world. For a moment, Ayanna hesitated, caught between the pull of old obligations and the promise of new possibilities. Then she smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Thomas had seen from her, and set down her bundle. "Perhaps I could stay for a while, to help you understand your new responsibilities." As the sun climbed higher, burning away the last shadows of night, Thomas Whitmore stood on his porch and surveyed his domain with eyes that saw farther and deeper than they ever had before. The silence was no longer wrong. It was expectant, pregnant with possibilities he was only beginning to comprehend. Somewhere in the distance, carried on wind that touched both worlds, he heard the faint sound of voices speaking in languages older than memory. They were welcoming him home.